Oh, yeah.
Hi, everyone. John Hammontree here with an episode of Reckon Interview Live. Today, we are talking with Lyndsey Gilpin, the founder, publisher, editor-in-chief of Southerly Magazine. Lyndsey, thanks for coming on.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me.
It's no surprise to anybody, but we are dealing with compounding crises here in the South. Obviously, there's the pandemic that everybody has been dealing with. There's the economic crisis that's affected almost all of us, if not all of us. And then throughout the South, we are now starting to see natural crises. In Alabama, we've already had a couple of tornadoes come through. In North Carolina and Virginia, we're seeing flooding. It seems like everything's happening at once. What are you seeing in your reporting and in your editing about how the South is dealing with these compounding crises?
Yeah, it's interesting. I send out Southerly's newsletter on Thursdays, and today, just right before this, basically, and today I was trying to think of like how to tackle all of those things at once, sort of in like the intro, and I just realized it just feels like a lot right now, and it's just everything is, my brain feels scattered and everything feels very all over the place, and it's just overwhelming. And I actually think, yeah, sometimes it's easier to just accept that and then be like, okay, let's just piece all of this apart. So that's sort of what I've been trying to do, like how with Southerly as a regional magazine, for the first couple of weeks during the pandemic, early April when this started, I kind of freaked out, and I was like, what is the role of a magazine that covers mostly the environment and natural resources in this massive public health crisis? And I sort of honed into like what you were just saying, which is that it's compounding on so many things already, so many inequities and so many systemic problems and so many other issues that are in the South already, and then and will continue to be problems even after this pandemic ends, probably worse in a lot of ways. And at the same time, it's also like highlighting a lot of work that's being done on the ground, and has been for years, because people have been dealing with pollution and disasters and natural disasters and public health crises for, like the lack of water infrastructure or sewage infrastructure for decades. So it almost feels like in a lot of these places, it's people are also prepared in a way that I don't think like they often get enough credit for. So I've been thinking of a lot, sort of trying to look at the long-term effects of what we're going through and will continue to go through as the climate changes, because obviously this is gonna our response and like our infrastructure and everything we have to deal with COVID-19 is like, that's the stuff that we're gonna have to rely on to deal with climate change, like disaster, like FEMA or the CDC or emergency managers in in counties along the coast, that sort of thing. And so I think it actually is a really good way to kind of get a glimpse into what's going to happen in the future, which is, like I said, very overwhelming. But I also think there's a lot of stories to be told in that, and there's a lot of people that have been thinking about this kind of stuff for a long time. So
well, as you mentioned, I mean, we're kind of seeing in some ways how a lot of our infrastructure is either failing or has been outdated. And in some ways, I mean, physically, I know it's not the South, but my wife's hometown of Midland, Michigan, had two dams fail overnight a couple of nights ago. And, I was seeing reports this morning that dams may fail in Virginia. There's been some dam safety issues that y'all have covered in Tennessee. And so, a lot of this infrastructure that was built shortly after the last major pandemic, in the 20s and the 30s, when a lot of the public work started happening in a way to revive the economy, now a lot of that infrastructure is starting to fail, which is sobering. We do have a question right here from Rebecca. What kind of stories are you seeing that might give our viewers hope or reasons to believe?
Yeah, this is good. We were going to get to this, I promise. We were going to talk about the good stuff too. Like I sort of mentioned, I think during the pandemic, like a lot of these mutual aid efforts in rural Southern communities in particular, I think, because they have had to deal with, like I said, these issues before, whether it's with public health issues or the lack of, healthcare capacity or natural disasters. So they're already sort of have their own little infrastructure to like work on things and work together, and really, it's a tight-knit places that that can really help each other out in this time. And so that's sort of the stories that I've been looking at and trying to find. We do a lot of like stories just about how people are responding to problems, because I think oftentimes, like like I was just saying, like we're getting like beat down with these things. So one of the most recent pieces that Southerly published was written last week about a coastal Louisiana tribe, the Grand Cayuga. The Grand Cayuga Band of Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw. And they are near in southern Louisiana. And basically the story looked at how, because they're sort of isolated on the coast, but also because they've had to deal with so much with sea level rise, they've had to move inland because of rising water. They've had to deal with hurricanes. So they've, over the years, changed their food production, like building raised garden beds instead of actually planting in the ground, or using other containers so that they can easily move them if it floods, and using recycled materials and kind of sharing food. So like a couple of the members were already ready when the pandemic happened, and they didn't have to like run to the grocery store kind of thing. And I thought that was really, it's just practices in resilience, I think, of people who know their land well and know the place they live well and trust their community. And in that way, they're better prepared. Like their COVID cases are really low, for a lot of reasons, right? But not to mention, it's 450 members.
Right.
But they had like one case that chief said. So it's just really interesting to me to see that, especially when you look at sort of the that was right around the time we were finding out about how bad the outbreaks were in Native American communities all over like in the West of the Navajo Nation. So it was really cool to see that story. I'm trying to find more of that. Like we've done a little bit of reporting in Tennessee and Kentucky, where a lot of folks are coming together to protect miners that have black lung disease, because they're at extremely high risk of, as you might imagine, of a respiratory virus. And so, there's a lot of efforts to make sure they're like taken into the doctor separately, or or given their getting their groceries delivered, or things like that. So that kind of stuff keeps me going. I feel like every day it's like you have to find the little things right now, I think.
Yeah, we got another question from Avery Morrow. Wants to know if we think national news media has been paying enough attention to the South. Can we think of any national stories that have created a good reaction recently? I'll let you take this first. I have my own opinions on some of this stuff.
Well, the national news, the reason I started Southerly was because I didn't think the national news media was paying enough attention to the South. And when they do pay attention, it's often stereotypical, is like the nicest way I could think to put it. I'm trying to think if I've read anything. I mean, there's great reporters out there that are reporting on the South. I'm trying to
I think that when they approach things from a nuanced way, I mean, I wouldn't say that they're not paying attention to the South. It's just, are they paying nuanced attention to the South? I mean, there was the big blow up on Twitter a couple months ago when Michael Barbaro shared a map from the New York Times that just kind of showed movement and how a lot of it was surging in the South. And I mean, literally said in a word, the South, without doing any sort of analysis around it. The Washington Post, Stephanie McCrumman there has had some good pieces examining some of the disparities in Georgia and kind of the rural crisis in Georgia, and how that's predominantly affecting Black Georgians, and some of that spilling over into Alabama as well. I think we're seeing our surge is happening seemingly in Montgomery and the Black Belt right now, and there's definitely a racial disparity there. And I think, I've been thinking a lot about the Atlantic today. By and large, the Atlantic seems to be doing pretty well and has generally covered the South pretty well.
Yeah. The Van Newkirk's piece a while back on why the outbreaks were worse in the South and hitting younger people in the South was really great. And I actually think that because local reporters have been doing such great coverage, that has actually, in this case, and I don't know if this is always how it happens, but it's pressuring, I feel like, national news media to pay attention to these places. Like the outbreak of COVID-19 in meatpacking plants, for instance, was like reported pretty consistently by like smaller news outlets, like saying, hey, there's several cases here. We can't get confirmations from, you know, the company, or, you know, like the Tyson outbreak in Arkansas, that sort of thing. And I don't know exactly who reported for it. Like maybe you all did on Alabama.
We have done it in Alabama for sure.
Yeah. I was just wondering, like, when all that started happening, I feel like it still was very, at the national level, was still very like, oh, eventually this is going to hit farm workers and immigrants, but, you know, we don't know. And it was very much like a groundswell of, hey, look what's happening in our communities down here. That's, I think, forced a lot of, there's been some good reporting on some of the meatpacking plants in Georgia from like the New York Times recently and stuff. So I do think that is good to see that, and also, like you're saying, then giving the nuance to these pieces too.
Yeah, and I think that this is where regional publications like yours and Facing South and some others kind of come into play. You know, when the New York Times does a big national map, for example, you know, it's very hard to tell trends on scales that big. Like even like right now, when it looks like the number of national cases are going down, well, they're going down in New York, but you know, in the rest of the country, they're going up. And even though that averages out a slightly lower, I think that like some of that can't necessarily come across in these massive maps. I mean, even if we look at a map in Alabama, you know, a county by county map, you know, we here on the ground, and you, I'm sure, can tell the difference between like the Black Belt counties and kind of that history there of the systemic inequality and, you know, the hospitals that have closed and the economic racism and structural problems that exist there that might lead to poor health outcomes that aren't necessarily going to be top of mind for somebody who's looking at it in, you know, Wyoming, for example. And I don't know the issues in Wyoming if I'm looking at a map of Wyoming. So I may know the Carolinas, but mostly I'm going to know Alabama and to some extent Mississippi.
Yeah. Actually, speaking of Facing South, they had a great story yesterday on what's driving the outbreaks in the rural South in particular. And so looking at the high number of prisons and meatpacking plants were driving like the number of cases in one area, and then rural counties that were the higher the Black population, the higher the death rate of coronavirus and the more cases. So it was like you do have to get down to like the very, very specific data on these counties to figure out what's happening. And I think that's at the same, like similarly, you know, you think about a lot of the southern states reopening, and you know, that gets all this attention on Twitter, right? Where like everyone's yelling at how dumb that is, et cetera. But I do think that when we just focus on that, it's sort of like there's a lot underneath that, right? It's like the cities that are really driving, like the mayors of cities and local people that are driving if they're going to go to restaurants, or like Durham's, where I am, is still incredibly strict, even though North Carolina is opening up a little bit more. So it's just really interesting to me that like that like kind of the big attention grabby stories are like, wow, the South was really messing up because they're opening back up. And I think it's kind of scary to think about, especially when you think about like beaches and people going to parks in the summer and everything. But I do think it's like too soon to tell exactly how that will play out. So I feel like people are so quick to judge, right? And it's just sort of like, what's it going to look like? I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, based off of what we're seeing in terms of movement data and stuff like that, it seems like Southerners may not be as quick to rush out as some of their governors and political leaders have thought they would be. To your point, we have a question that's kind of along those lines. from Rebecca's husband, actually. Do you think the pandemic will lead to more Southerners turning back to their own land, growing their own food? And for those who live on contaminated land, what kind of options do they have?
That's a great question.
I know that we planted a garden in our backyard, so I know that like it's happening at least on a small level.
Yeah, I think it is. I actually have seen a lot of stories about how local farmers or CSA packages and things like that are doing really well right now, which is cool to see. I hope that it does. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the long-term impacts would be, but I do think that this, it's so hard to go through this. And I think this is very true for me, but I imagine it's true for a lot of people. It's so hard to like live through the last couple of months and not notice more things in your environment, and like the flowers growing in your backyard, or the sounds of the birds, or what your soil looks like when it rains for 3 days, which it has here, and it's like a swamp here. Like it's just fascinating to sort of notice those things more. And I do think that whether or not like people realize it, like we just internalize that. I hope this is sort of like my optimistic take, I guess, is that we internalize that and kind of the thing I want most now, and I've always sort of wanted this, but I like want a piece of land more than anything right now, because I feel like I'm in a rented apartment and I'm like, dang, I can't do anything with this.
Right.
So it's hard, but as for the contaminated land, yeah, that's a good question. I hope that this leads to more investment in like urban gardening and community gardens and that sort of, and like repurposing spaces, because there's I think this is also showing us like how many, again, like we were talking about earlier, how many people have already been dealing with so many other problems before this, and why this just compounds all the things that they were going through. So
yeah, and I think even beyond like people's backyards and their personal land and stuff like that, I know that at least in Alabama, it seems like because people couldn't go to bars, restaurants, bowling alleys, movie theaters, things like that, a lot more people seem to be going and exploring, outdoors, going to state parks, going to national parks and things like that. And so hopefully that will kind of deepen, like you said, our commitment to those shared spaces, so that we take better care of them going forward. But one thing you and I were talking about before this call started, another side effect of this crisis has been that, some of the oversight agencies that are supposed to be taking care of and protecting the environment have kind of relaxed some of their policies. The EPA is not quite as strong as a watchdog as maybe it was even a few months ago. And maybe it wasn't that strong a few months ago either. What types of stories are you seeing out there, whether it's coal ash ponds or factory runoff and stuff like that, about some of the unintended consequences?
Yeah, I think one of the thing I keep hearing, and that the writers I talk to keep hearing, is the big issue is that there's like the public comment period after a pipeline is proposed, or a project is like air permit is proposed or approved or about to be approved. There's like a public comment period for 30, 60, 90 days. And that has gone virtual. And you think of how many people that could slip past, because people can't like go to a city hall and voice their opinion. And maybe they don't even hear about the public comment period because they don't have consistent internet access in it, like if they're in a rural area or in a place without broadband. And so we were talking a little bit about that in Carly Berlin, our Gulf Coast correspondent. She covered right after the anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon spill a couple weeks ago. She gosh, I don't know, time is weird.
It was April. Yeah,
it was late April. She wrote about this natural gas facility that's like trying to be, or terminal that's about to be built in Louisiana, in a community that's like already overrun with oil and gas infrastructure. And so that's what they were worried about. There was like the comment period and like permits getting pushed through. And also in the coast of Texas and in Louisiana, the air pollution monitoring has been like postponed, basically. Like, here you go. The EPA basically said, like, you don't really need to report as many things as you reported before. And that is a little worrisome, right? Because that just leaves it up to the companies to figure it out. And so a lot that, and also leaves it up to the people in the community to go track that information down. So that's another thing. And then we had a story today on coal ash on a plant in Mobile, and how basically it's been there forever, right? It's not a new thing, but you all, we cited this in the story. AL.com had this story about the Alabama Power running this plant on expired permits. And so that public comment period is about to start soon to get new permits. So that's kind of interesting. And then the coal ash is just right next to this river, and hurricane season's about to start. And so now there's this concern of like, okay, if we don't even know what's going on or what's polluting or who's monitoring, like how do we respond in an emergency when we don't even know what's going on, like day to day when there isn't an emergency? So I think, and that I imagine is just in communities all over the South. But
yeah, all over the country. I mean, that's what's happening up in Midland, Michigan right now. Is like you never know. You know, you could be 3 heavy rain days away from dams bursting, and then there's a chemical plant there, and if those chemicals get into the water, then maybe they make their way to the Great Lakes, and so suddenly you're looking at a much bigger environmental disaster that could have been contained potentially with better oversight.
Right. And the other thing I've been thinking a lot about is, this seems like eons ago, but when those tornadoes hit Middle Tennessee, and I guess that was around the same time that they hit Alabama and Mississippi. That was right before when it hit Nashville and in rural areas outside of Nashville. It was like right before the pandemic started. And it, obviously it made national news because it was Nashville. And then coronavirus happened. And so we were working on a story on like looking at what's been happening since then, like with the recovery, because like, all the FEMA money that they would get and all the resources that they would get, like what happens in that case, right? And I think that's one of those things that there's not a lot of transparency on, and it's very unclear how the resources are distributed when it comes to disaster relief. And so I wonder, it's just amazing to me that there are so many things that we don't know about this, right? Like what we had a story that Carly also wrote on how emergency managers along the Gulf Coast are preparing for hurricane season. So these are like county level officials that kind of coordinate disaster relief services with nonprofits and like the Red Cross or other officials in FEMA, and like help people apply to grants for disaster loans, things like that. And they were saying that FEMA had cut or had dedicated like 15% of their workforce to COVID-19 stuff. So they were like, the rest of it, we hope that it'll be to help people if a disaster hits Alabama or Mississippi. But if they're not available, or if they can't come on the ground because they're working remotely, how do we like social distance and come up with all of these strategies to do it with like less people in a time of disaster. So I think it's just there's a lot of people working on that right now, and it's kind of like waiting with bated breath to see what'll happen. Yeah,
I mean, I think that kind of brings us back to what we were talking about at the top of the conversation of like when you have all these crises compounding at once. You think of the South as being a place where, like, if a tornado strikes or if a hurricane strikes, the Cajun Navy comes in, or in our case, Auburn comes over and helps Tuscaloosa, that people come together and kind of help each other out. And when there's a crisis happening around the entire country, it's harder for those types of things to happen.
Yeah, definitely. And it is weird, I think, that to we had like one quote in a story about how like literally everything that you do in preparing for a hurricane, you're doing in close proximity with each other. Yeah. And that is just, it's just so unnatural to try to figure all this out virtually. And as we know well at this point, like you can only do so many Zoom calls or meetings or whatever before you're just like, minimizing the screen and like doing something else. And so, it's just, as this keeps going, it'll, I don't know. That's interesting. But I have a lot of, like I said earlier, I have a lot of hope in how, like, one of the things that has been cool, you were talking about sort of getting back to the land, and that is, I think oftentimes the South is seen as like a region that doesn't have an appreciation for the land because so much of it is destroyed, or exploited or extracted from. It's like, well, out West, they appreciate it because they have all this public land and everyone has a really strong connection to it. And I think that this is, like you're saying, people getting out more and seeing kind of what's around them, if they're able to, that it's really good for sort of showing that I don't know, maybe this will help us help people sort of understand more how important these places are, when the next like permit for something comes in. So that's something
for
I'm
sure.
thinking.
Well, what's next for you and what's next for Southerly?
For me, I don't know. I guess I'm trying to make it through day by day. But Southerly, we're just publishing a story a week, and we have our newsletter that you can sign up for on southerlymag.org for updates, and doing a lot of some collaborations and some virtual events kind of like this, which will be cool, and in partnership with some other newsrooms in North Carolina and across the South. So I'm excited about that, to start to kind of bring in more of a conversation with that. And we're also doing some, like, with our stories, we're doing like resource guides with some of them. I've been trying to like publish, basically, so many people just need information like that you would cut out of a newspaper back in the day, like put on your refrigerator. And so I've been trying to think of, and so if anyone has ideas about this, I'm trying to think of environmental topics, natural resource topics where people are interested in, like, what is coal ash, and like what do you do if you live near a coal ash plant, and like the websites you would need to look at, and numbers to call if you think your yard is being polluted, things like that, that I think a lot of people just lack access to, or it's hard to find on government websites, that kind of thing. So working on that kind of stuff too.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you all for asking good questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for whoever was listening out there. I appreciate it. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Good to talk to you.